Virality Project is a coalition of misinformation researchers organized by Stanford University. Now, during the course of the pandemic, people associated with the Virality Project appointed themselves head COVID censors and set out to constrain the boundaries of acceptable speech on social media. The Virality Project's goals, above and beyond all else, were to protect the perceived integrity of the federal health bureaucracy, of vaccine manufacturers and government vaccine policymakers, and to advance mainstream establishment narratives and interests in general. This meant, of course, that the Virality Project frequently pushed Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms to restrict speech related to COVID-19, even if the underlying claims were true. Indeed, true information about vaccines that in the Virality Project's opinion had the possibility of causing vaccine skepticism should be suppressed as misinformation under Stanford's thinking. Now, we are learning about this due to some new reporting from independent journalist Matt Taibbi as part of the Twitter files, which are ongoing disclosures authorized by new Twitter CEO Elon Musk concerning the content moderation policies at that company under its previous leadership. What we're seeing time and time again is that Twitter faced tremendous pressure to censor speech relating to elections, Hunter Biden, COVID, other topics. And this overwhelming pressure was coming from the federal government itself, from the FBI, from the Department of Homeland Security, from the State Department, from the CDC, and from the White House itself. But the pressure was also coming from an entire industry of think tanks, NGOs, fact-checking organizations, and academics whose work was, in many cases, supported by the federal government. They spent your tax dollars building infrastructure and information surveillance with the ultimate goal of silencing you. Now let's look at some examples. A June 2021 report by the Virality Project warned Twitter that the release of Dr. Fauci's emails was being used to, quote, exacerbate distrust of Dr. Fauci and U.S. public health officials. That same report lamented that the emails were being, quote, interpreted to suggest that the coronavirus may have leaked from a lab. The Virality Project also flagged reports of people contracting COVID after getting vaccinated, true vaccine side effects, and, quote, worrisome jokes. The hall monitors at the Virality Project described all of these instances as disinformation events or potential violations that the project explicitly targeted, quote, true content which might promote vaccine hesitancy. This coalition, which was working with government agencies, NGOs, the social media companies themselves, well, they took the position that even true information could count as dangerous misinformation if its effect was to encourage a policy that clashed with the expert consensus. In one email to Twitter, the Virality Project warned that conversations that included fears of vaccine passports should be suppressed because being anti-vaccine passport was a gateway to being anti-vaccine. That was considered a misinformation event. This is insidiously wrong, of course. Vaccine passports were a real policy implemented in the U.S. during the pandemic. People who were worried about them were right to express that concern. Even today, 3 years after the pandemic, at a time where COVID-19 thankfully stopped having considerable impact on our daily lives, the U.S. still has a vaccine passport system to enter the country, unlike much of the rest of the Western world. Tennis player Novak Djokovic, for example, was recently prevented from entering the country and attending the Miami Open because of his unvaxxed status. That's not misinformation. That's true. But over and over again, we see that the goal of efforts like the Virality Project isn't to simply correct supposed factual errors, but to tell you what you're supposed to think, what you're allowed to say. Now, my own reporting, the Facebook files, showed that the CDC took the exact same approach as the Virality Project, frequently warning Meta, the parent company of Facebook, that any criticism of vaccine policy could theoretically promote vaccine hesitancy. And the result was widespread suppression of free speech. Now, if we still value the First Amendment, we must resist these pernicious calls for censorship, a call that is coming from a sordid coalition of truth czars and ideological activists masquerading as fact-checkers. So another Twitter files disclosure, another example coming to light of the efforts that all of these people went to convince social media to censor free speech. And I keep returning to this well because it's a one with a lot of content in it.
Yeah, I think this is a huge gap that I think a lot of liberals who have been ignoring the content of the Twitter files and thinking that they can ignore it because they believe that misinformation is a real problem that needs to be suppressed, even if it goes against certain kinds of speech concerns, are really missing. That what we're talking about in so many instances is the suppression or attempted suppression of true information that the people who are seeking it to be suppressed admit is actually true. But there's this disconnect in part because these various institutions, the CDC, people like this organization you're describing here, seem to believe that they are incapable of explaining to the public why they might not want to act on certain kinds of true facts or engaging with them directly about the ways they might be persuaded to go ahead and take advantage of certain health benefits of things like vaccines or masking or whatever, without outright lying to them about the mixed opinions about what the pros and cons are. You have to completely keep information from normal people in the view of these institutions rather than trust them on their own. And I think there's a real issue there with that confidence gap between institutions and the population that they're trying to skirt instead of dealing with head on. What do you make of it, Batya?
Yeah, I mean, the question I keep coming back to here is why is this not catching on more generally with the more mainstream public? I mean, it's very rare that I'll talk to somebody who's not sort of very active on Twitter who feels the level of outrage about this that we do. And I wonder if that's because Twitter itself is a sort of platform that's mostly used by elites to police other elites. And so to us, this is sort of very infuriating. And we can see how this led to actual, real world consequences. But I think I'm curious what both of you think about that. Why is this story not catching on more broadly?
Well, I think a part of the reason is obviously this work is being done by independent journalists, Matt Taibbi, Michael Schellenberger, Bari Weiss. The New York Times, CNN, MSNBC haven't had the same level of access to these files. They haven't had any access. They have to rely on it. Third parties. So look, I can understand in some level of them saying, look, we would like to investigate this, but we're not being given access. But I should think they would be covering at least the discussion that's being had, right? They're not even saying, well, here's other people weighing in and, you can decide what you think for it on your own. It's also interesting to me in some of these disclosures that came through, the flagging of misinformation that's just kind of attacks on Dr. Fauci's reputation, is keeping him and people like him making sure they remain respected by the public. Is that really the same thing as spreading misinformation and untruths? It shows you how, to the extent the media is ignoring this, and this kind of narrative that protecting the prevailing health authorities' reputations or their right to make policy is the same thing as stopping people from saying crazy things about vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me, Robby, we've talked about this a couple of times now, how at one point when I was working for the Bernie campaign, I was criticized or warned not to promote certain so-called Russian narratives, those Russian narratives being that America has a history of not being especially favorable to Black Americans under the law. And they were saying this is a narrative that Russian bots were pushing and that this was going to have negative outcomes in the election. And my pushback was to say, if the underlying fact is true, even if some Russian disinformation campaign is capitalizing on those negative facts, you should deal with the underlying facts. And I think that the same is true in this situation. I think that part of why this issue is getting ignored, in addition to the reasons that you pointed out, Robby, is that it reflects negatively on many of the mainstream media institutions that benefit from these narratives and have been perpetuating them themselves. And as a consequence, a lot of the general public really does believe that some of the stuff that is being labeled as misinformation is actually untrue material. And I still, to this day, have conversations with folks about kind of normal, known things now about how other countries don't have vaccine passports and we do. The kind of nonsensicalness of some of the policies that require people to be fired, or you don't, you have to. We've covered the story of all the people in New York who had gotten back pay as a consequence of being fired. People who for years refused to kind of internalize it in the information about how you can still transmit COVID even if you got vaccinated. vaccinated. That stuff took a long time to trickle out, in part because there was a resistance to covering that true information in these mainstream news outlets. And it's not clear to me that they're really prepared to engage with the role they've been playing in this the whole time.
Indeed. But we'll have more Rising right after this. Stay tuned.